Venture capital works really well. Some of the most outsized returns have come from this asset class. It's designed to take big risks, and with big risks come big rewards. But when they hit, they really have the opportunity to disrupt and transform an industry. Tesla, Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, all of these companies were created in part by a venture capitalist giving them the money. When you look more closely at it, the startup founders that are receiving the funding are 98% men. Women and underrepresented minorities are not receiving the funding in proportion to their population.
Why do a commission like this? The idea of understanding how do you unearth great innovation across the nation is critical. How do we look at something that has been working historically from the perspective of returning capital and returning dollars, and saying, how do I make sure that that continues to be equitably distributed?
This is not about quotas or lowering the bar. This is about recognizing that there's a missed opportunity. When you invest in women and underrepresented minorities, in turn, you attract an audience that you're not attracting today. That's not a cost, that's an opportunity.
Go ahead and give me a hand clap.
At 24, quit my job and started Blavity. I knew that the odds were against me when it came to fundraising. There were very few Black venture-funded companies that I knew about. Finding venture capitalists who care about companies that maybe don't match their pattern is difficult. It's difficult as a woman, and it is difficult as a person of color, and it's certainly difficult if you're both.
Flipstick is a little device that goes on the back of your phone.
Having recently gone through the process of raising money, and it was incredibly difficult for our company. You know, we weren't in tech, you know, I'm Black and gay, and I've never raised money before. You know, it was incredibly difficult.
We spent time engaging with great researchers and practitioners to plant the seed for the next generation of thought leaders in this space to help us generate new solutions and ideas. The outcome of those will be impactful.
We're going to want products and services that represent who we are and who we're becoming. And if we're not funding those types of ideas, we're leaving out a tremendous buying power.
Startups are a huge driver of employment in this country, and diverse founders, women founders, Black founders, Hispanic founders, they are going to hire more people that look like them, and that is a better reflection of our economy. That's going to mean a higher GDP, that means higher wages, closing the wage gap for women and for people of color.
My key takeaway is, hey, let us show you what's out there and what you're missing. And I think once VCs get a taste of that success, the sky's the limit.
Everyone needs to say, what am I doing? First, do I recognize that there is an issue here? Getting to the point where you realize there is an issue and I have a role in actually advancing the solutions to this issue is a first important step. And I do think that this report is positioned to try to help us all think about the role that we play in advancing a more inclusive and better innovative set of companies coming out of the United States.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Leary. I'm Co-Vice Dean for Faculty and Research at the Olin School of Business at Washington University in St. Louis. And on behalf of our Dean, Anjan Thakur, I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you to the Brookings Institution this morning. For those of you who are joining us here in person today, those of you who are joining us virtually online back in St. Louis and elsewhere, we're glad that you are with us. I'm privileged to be able to welcome you all and to introduce and represent what was really an extraordinary partnership that has produced the exciting work that we're going to be discussing this morning. So why are we here? Well, as you saw in the video a moment ago, we're here to discuss a persistent inequity that has really cast a shadow over the whole innovation ecosystem here in the United States and around the world. And the WashU Olin Brookings Commission has not only documented the extent of that inequity, which is important in its own right for raising awareness, but they've also put considerable energy into trying to identify and explore some of the underlying root causes that are driving that persistent inequity. And equally important, they have proposed a slate of ideas for how we can begin to address this issue. So I'm proud that we have the opportunity to share this work with you today. This is work that's produced through a powerful partnership between Brookings and WashU Olin Business School. At Olin, we believe that business leaders have the power to change the world for good. And with Brookings, we can combine the academy, business leaders, and policymakers to help drive solutions toward that goal. So today you'll see the results of this 8-month-plus project from the WashU Olin Brookings Commission. Members of that commission, along with our faculty conveners and PhD students, have met with industry practitioners. They've hosted an academic conference which drew researchers in this field from across the country and around the globe. And they thought deeply about ways to confront this challenge. All of this work has been made possible by a generous grant from the Bellwether Foundation. And so I want to acknowledge and thank Bellwether as we start this morning. The Bellwether Foundation is driven to improve the quality of life by supporting innovative programs that make a positive impact. And the project that we're discussing today is actually the second of 3 projects that have been funded by Bellwether through our Olin Brookings Commission partnership. I especially want to acknowledge and thank the Foundation's Ginger Smith, who really saw the vision in our plan to tackle important societal issues through business insights and policy recommendations. So I believe Ginger is joining us in our watch party back in St. Louis, so thank you, Ginger. I'm deeply grateful for the time and the commitment of everyone who's involved in this project. And you'll be introduced to them shortly, and you'll be able to learn more about them in the Olin Brookings Commission's full report, which is available for download on their website, which is referenced in the handout for those of you who are in person today, and also through the link that we're sharing right now in the virtual chat. The team's research, their conversations, and their debates have focused on framing the issues well and also offering a path forward for those who care about solving this inequity. So thanks to all of you for your work on this project. And so now, without further ado, I want to introduce our facilitator for today's presentation, who is Doug Villard. Doug is the lead faculty convener for this group. He's also a professor of practice in entrepreneurship and the director of our entrepreneurship program at WashU Olin Business School. So Doug, I'll have you come up and take it away.
Well, I'm excited to be here today. We've been working on this project for a number of months, so it's fun and exciting to reveal it today. When previous Dean Mark Taylor approached me with this topic, they had just tackled the topic of opioid crisis, and we're looking for the next topic, and he wanted it to be in entrepreneurship. And it happened to be at a time when I was lecturing about venture capital in class, which is a very exciting topic for my students. They're very interested in this topic and starting their own companies and raising venture capital. And I like to bring in founders that have previously raised venture capital to talk to them. And my class is a very diverse class, both race and gender. And with that inclusivity within the classroom, I also want to represent that on stage too as I bring in speakers. And we have a very hard time finding folks in our network who are women or people of color that had actually raised venture capital to come and speak to class. There's many entrepreneurs that are women and people of color, but actually raising money was few and far between. And when you do find them and ask them to come and speak to your class, they politely say, everybody is asking me to come speak in class. And I have to actually run my company at some point too. So as I was looking at this, and that had just happened the morning that the dean asked us to do this, I took a closer look, and I apologize on my own for not being as intentional on this subject as I could be. But very few women and people of color are funded by venture capitalists, and we're going to go through all of that data today. And we've known about this. This is not new news. We've known about it, and it's gotten a little bit better. but not by much. And we'll go into that today. So our agenda here is, one, is to talk about the commission and our process and who we are and what we did over the last 8 months. We're going to really dive into the data that I alluded to just a moment ago. Then we're going to talk about why this matters. So it's a fact, but why does it matter for the United States and the world? Also, through our process, we identified 5 friction points that we believe are leading to this inequity. And then lastly, I mean, it's one thing to talk about this and talk about the problem, but we actually want to offer today some recommendations on how we might improve. So, to speak to the Commission's process, please join me in welcoming Professor Giselle Marcus, Professor of DEI at the Washington University in St. Louis Olin Business School. So Giselle, welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Doug. Our Brookings Commission, as Mark had mentioned, is a 3-year endeavor, and we are delighted at the fact that it convenes 4 groupings of people. It convenes our Olin WashU faculty, our Brookings Institution scholars, our industry leaders, as well as students. As Mark had also mentioned, very delighted that the Bellwether Foundation has funded this endeavor for us because of the fact that it actually addresses mega trends in terms of issues that impact people day to day and all types of people. So it's very inclusive in that mission. As also has been mentioned, this is actually the second commission. The first commission actually addressed the U.S. prescription opioid crisis using artificial intelligence. It has been just a delight and a pleasure to work with the commissioners on this particular project. They consist of funders, policy influencers, and founders. And they are Lori Coulter, the co-founder and CEO of Somersault, Morgan DeBon, the president and CEO of Blavity, Akeem Shannon, the CEO and founder of Flipstick, Charlie Cooksey, the CEO and founder of WePower, Martin Hunt, the CEO of Swan Lab USA Ventures, and Andre Perry of the Brookings Institution, where we are today. He is a senior fellow. Want to talk about those of us that assisted to actually undergird the work of the commissioners, consisting of researchers, faculty, and students. Doug Villard, who you have already met, Professor of Practice in Entrepreneurship. Myself, Giselle Marcus, Professor of Practice in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Dedrick Carter, Professor of Entrepreneurship, as well as our Vice Chancellor of Innovation. Daniel Elfenbein, our Professor of Organization and Strategy. And 2 of our students, Mingzu Wang, who actually had been a PhD. We started with her as a PhD candidate, and she recently completed her dissertation successfully, so we can now call her a PhD. So hand claps all around for her. And also Aditi Bashist, who is a PhD student in organizational behavior. I want to talk a little bit about our process. While our first official meeting with the commission began in September of 2022, before that, the research team, the faculty, and students did a great deal in terms of the pre-work to get ready for this commission and for the journey that we actually had been on. In September, we had our first meeting in St. Louis, where we really began to frame the problem as well as explore possible causes. In December of November 2022, we were right here at the Brookings Institution, and we really had the pleasure and the delight of hearing from academic research experts in this space, actually more than 15 of them that helped us in development of potential solutions. In February of 2023, we were in Silicon Valley, and we had the opportunity to socialize the potential of public policy solutions with Silicon Valley practitioners. And then we're here today to actually round out and close out this endeavor and present our perspectives as well as issue a call to action. I'm going to bring my colleague, Doug Villard, back up to actually talk to us about what venture capital actually is and how such companies actually become funded.
So So I want to play professor just for a second and talk about what is venture capital. I mean, if you look at this list here, it shows you what the types of companies VCs are looking for. And not every company is what's called venture backable. So I'll give you an example. And I like candles very much, actually. I love lighting them. I love the mood of them, the smells of them, et cetera. And if I was starting a candle company, I would be very proud to do so. But it would be difficult to raise venture capital for my candle company unless it was in such a way that I was planning to disrupt the candle industry and be the number one candle maker ever, and make the others almost obsolete. So we're really mostly looking in venture capital for that type of company that can be disruptive. An example would be, 15 years ago, trying to hail a taxi, for example. If you remember those days, we're waving our hand on street corners, hoping that we get picked up in time. Not quite sure when we're going to get picked up, what the route's going to be, what it's going to cost. No record of us actually getting in there for safety reasons. Much less to even something simple like getting a receipt afterward, right? So when you look at what Uber has done, for example, disrupted the way that we think about getting a ride service, right? So it's those types of companies that they're looking for. And even when you do meet the criteria or have the network to actually get into pitch, generally speaking, they'll take 1 out of 1,000. 1 out of 1,000. And these companies. Venture capital has been American innovation now for 80 years. These are 3 companies that have happened in my lifetime. Apple, Google, Facebook, ones that I use all day, every day, and ones that you do as well. So it's a really interesting asset class and a tremendous opportunity that has driven growth for the United States. But when you look at who actually receives the funding and how much money they receive, it's fascinating. So to explore that further, we're going to bring up Professor Dan Elfenbein, who is a professor who chairs the Strategy and Entrepreneurship Department at Washington University, who's going to walk us through these numbers. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Giselle. Thank you, Mark. Before I dive in, I also want to just acknowledge how grateful I am, not only for the commitment of the commissioners who are here today, but also for their colleagueship. It's extended so far as to one of them lent me a tie for this presentation, so I really appreciate it. It's also been a real pleasure to be part of this commission work. I'm a professor who studies strategic management and entrepreneurship, and my training is in industrial organization economics. I'm not a gender and diversity researcher. And like Doug, my introduction to this topic was a bit happenstance. My outstanding PhD student, Ming-Tzu Wong, in her 4th year, had collected a data set of all of the companies that have been acquired by big tech in the United States between 2009 and 2018. This is a data set with 1,000+ founders in it. And as we convened a research meeting to talk about what she was going to do with this data, one of my colleagues, a labor economist, Bart Hamilton, said, "Oh, you should really talk about differences between how these acquisitions affect the careers of women founders and men founders." And Ming kind of looked at us and said, "I'm not sure we have enough data points in this data set to do it." And Bart says, "Well, all you need is like 100 data points in these founders in order to do the statistical analysis that we would need." He said, "But it's more like 30, 35. And then Bart says, "Well, how about instead of discussing differences between women and men, you look across ethnicity?" And Ming says, "I have even worse news. I don't have data on the ethnicity of these founders. It's almost impossible to get. But looking at their pictures on LinkedIn, I can tell you that overwhelmingly they're white and Asian men." So when Doug was looking for a faculty member to join this commission, I raised my hand. I was interested in this question that Ming had raised in her dissertation research. I'm curious, what's going on here? Is the pattern that she found in her data set among a subset of entrepreneurs, a subset of founders, pervasive and widespread throughout the industry? If so, is it changing? And what explains it? And so the answer to that first question is yes. This lack of representation of women, Latinx, and Black people among entrepreneurs receiving venture capital funds is widespread, and it is pervasive. For my commission colleagues who work in this space, this underrepresentation is completely obvious. But for those of us who don't work in this venture capital industry and who don't actively seek to raise money from venture capitalists, let me take a few moments to review the numbers. So women represent roughly half of the US population. And in 2021 and 22, when the venture capital industry invested $492 billion in venture capital in the United States, founding teams that had at least one woman received only 13.5% of the funds. Founding teams that were comprised of all women, only women founding teams, only got 1% of this $492 billion that was invested. By contrast, teams that were comprised all of men received 82% of these funds. Hispanic, Latinx Americans currently represent 18.9% of the population. Over these 2 years, the data that we have indicates that only 2.5% of venture capital funds went to Latinx founders. Black Americans currently represent 13.6% of the population. Over these 2 years, data indicates that 1.4% of venture capital funds went to black founders. To say these figures are low is an understatement. They are low both in absolute terms and when compared to representation of women, black, Latinx people in other sectors of the economy. In particular, they are low when compared to the proportions of STEM graduates or business graduates from which the pool of entrepreneurs is typically drawn. And I was reminded that over the past decades, the proportion of STEM degrees and business degrees awarded to women and people of color has risen steadily in the United States, yet the proportion of VC funds raised by these groups has lagged well behind. When we look at these data, we can ask the question, how many women and people of color would a gender-blind and race-blind system produce? By our estimates, women are underrepresented by a factor of somewhere between 3 and 15 times. Latinx and Hispanic people by a factor of somewhere between 5 and 8, and black people are underrepresented by a factor of 5 to 10 times among recipients of venture capital. As my colleague Lori Coulter pointed out yesterday, one interpretation of this is that women have to do at least 3 times as many pitches to get the same amount of funding as a man would get. That's a lot of extra work. One of the things that we know, and my colleague Andre Perry will expound upon this, is that people tend to invest in others that look like them. The venture capital community that stewards these funds and makes these investments is aware of the problem, and it has been working hard in recent years to draw a more diverse set of decision makers into the group of people who work in venture capital firms. Nonetheless, in 2022, for which we have the most recent data, the breakdown of the venture capital decision makers by race and gender remains skewed. As this chart shows, white and Asian men represent 32.4% of the US population, but 72.2% of VC decision makers, the people who decide where funds go. White and Asian women represent 33% of the population, but 19.8% of decision makers inside VC. Black men, 6.7% of the population, but 2% of venture capital decision makers, underrepresented by a factor of a little bit more than 3. Hispanic men, underrepresented by a factor of about 5. Black women, close to 10 times underrepresented. Hispanic women, also about 10 times underrepresented. I want to take you back for a moment to the question of how hard it is for women entrepreneurs to access venture capital. We looked at all venture capital funding in the United States between 2011 and 2021. During this time, slightly more than 67,000 ventures were funded by venture capital across all rounds. More than 80% of those ventures that were funded had no women, teams with no women. A little under 20% of the funded teams had one or more women on them, and 5% of those teams were only women, consisted of only women. Overall, 130,000 and change number of people were part of these founded teams that received funding, and of those 130,000, 11,600 were women. That's about 9%. By the way, we would love to replicate this analysis by race. Unfortunately, there's currently no reliable way to do this. Data on founder ethnicity has got to be imputed from available information, names, pictures, and other things. It's error prone, particularly in historical data like this. More on this when we get to the recommendations. But back to Lori's observation. It looks like women have to work a lot harder to get VC funding. But it's not only that. When we looked at the data, it was clear that women are not only less likely to receive funding, but when they are funded, they receive lower amounts. The chart here shows the average amount raised as a function of team composition. So the size of the team is on the row, the number of women in the team are the columns. Founding teams with one man and no women over this time period on average raised about 12 million. Founding teams with one woman and 0 men, first row, second column, raised 4.6 million on average. We'll see in this chart that the larger the founding team, the more money was successfully raised. So as you go down, you see you raise more money. But in each case, the proportion of women in the team, the greater the proportion of the women in the team, the lower the average amount raised by the team, with one notable exception that's driven by an interesting outlier. So to summarize this chart, if there's one thing I wanted you to take away from it, it's that all male teams averaged nearly 19 million in fundraising over this period, whereas all women teams averaged only 4.6 million. And again, we would like to replicate this analysis with Black and Latinx founders, but from talking with other researchers who are working in this area, it would require hundreds of hours of research time to do and substantial investment in data acquisition expense. So these patterns of underrepresentation are stark, they're pronounced, they're persistent, and underrepresentation spans both the community of funders and funded companies. What makes them all the more surprising to me is that they fly in the face of good management practice. A recent paper by my colleagues Sophie Calder-Wong at Wharton and Paul Gompers at Harvard Business School examines the relationship between diversity among venture capital decision makers and performance. Their research takes advantage of a well-established pattern that senior partners who have more daughters than sons tend to hire more women in their organizations. That's the left-hand chart over here. So Calder-Wong and Gompers look at what happens when senior partners have a daughter rather than a son. Presumably the gender of a new child is random. And this creates what we would call a quasi-experiment in which we can compare what happens to firms when partners randomly have a son versus have a daughter. The bottom line of their research is that when a partner has a daughter, they hire 5% more women, raising the number of women decision makers in their organization from 10% to 15%, and that this is associated with increases in deal success from 25% to 30% on average, and internal rate of return for the funds. So research like this should provide a major wake-up call to us all. How many ideas are we missing out on in the current system? How much can fund performance improve if we think that investors would be able to use a more diverse set of experience in their decisions, and that they can access a more diverse portfolio of people to fund? To speak to these issues, please allow me to introduce Akeem Shannon, who you saw on the video, CEO of Flipstick, a great company that almost got stuck because of these fundraising issues.
Thank you, Dan. So, we've seen the numbers, right? We know this is a problem, and we can see how large the problem is, but I think the real question is, why fix it? Why does this really matter? Why are we here today? And I think the first is that there's a huge economic opportunity that's here, right? When you're only investing in 20% of your population, that leaves 80% on the sidelines. This is 80% of the population that has innovative ideas, new ideas that we could invest in and ultimately grow our economy. So as we look out into how we're performing against our biggest competitors on the world stage, we have to ask ourselves, why are we sitting, most of us, on the sideline? As Dan mentioned, I found myself as one of those businesses that was looking at failure. We know that companies that don't receive capital are more likely to fail. And while I had an amazing opportunity, some would call it the Super Bowl of a small business, to appear on a TV show called Shark Tank, a year later, I realized that, hey, I'm not growing. I'm stagnant. And I realized that I needed to raise capital. But when I started, I didn't see myself as one of these disruptive technologies that could go and raise capital. But once I did raise that capital, I saw revenues jump 900% in a single year. And so when we invest in diverse founders that sometimes may not see themselves as VC backable in the beginning, we will see an increase in jobs and an increase in overall a benefit to our economy. We also know that when you invest in diverse founders, companies that are more diverse have more innovative ideas. And according to people like Forbes and Deloitte and Harvard, they also can see up to a 30% increase in EBITDA. As we continue to tackle the income gap and the wealth gap that is growing in this country by investing in these diverse founders and women, Latinx, and Black founders, we can start to close that gap by giving these businesses and their employees the opportunity to grow. So to come address the friction points that have led to these issues, I'd like to invite up my colleague, Andre from Brookings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to address some friction points. I'm Andre Perry, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm also a Professor of Practice of Economics at the WashU Olin School of Business. So and it's always a pleasure to work with my colleagues in St. Louis, even if I can have the opportunity to lend a tie to a friend, I will. And it's a good tie, good tie. But I'm going to talk about friction points, and what that is it's trying to explain what may influence some of the data that was presented by Dan with the good tie earlier. And I'm going to go over three, and then I'm going to invite my colleague, Charlie Cooksey, to follow up with two more. Data transparency, homophily, and followed established patterns. Now, a lack of transparency. At the Brookings Institution and at WashU Olin School of Business, when we want to look at a problem, the first thing we do typically is dive in the data. We explore a publicly accessible database and play around with the demographics in it to get a sense of what's going on here. But in this case, we're unable to do that, largely because there isn't a publicly accessible database. The databases that have this information, and it's incomplete and it's proprietary. So when you're talking about Crunchbase, PitchBook, or Preqin, these are databases you have to purchase in order to get that information, and the information that's presented is not complete, in the sense that you have to make all these imputations or do some data scraping in order to make some type of estimates. And so this lack of transparency really throttles our ability to address problems and to help innovators create new products, create innovation. So this lack of information is really a hindrance to all of us who are either trying to expand who receives venture funding, as well as figure out what are the structural barriers to that funding. The next thing is biases that reinforce status quo. And I'm going to introduce this concept called homophily, and then I'm going to say what it's not. It's not some rash that needs a venture-backed pharmaceutical company to address. Plainly spoken, what homophily is birds of a feather flock together, or in this case, birds of a feather invest together. That we are more likely to invest in people or feel more comfortable investing in people that are our social relatives. We went to the same school. We are of the same race. We come from the same coast. And that's one of the reasons why you see white men, Asian men, West Coast men, certain institutions over-indexed in terms of who receives a venture capital. So this homophily thing is real. But it doesn't necessarily explain all of the differences. Clearly, sexism and racism is another or other sociological factors influencing the numbers that you saw. So between homophily and some of your common fair racism and sexism, that's generally at play. But again, we want to learn how much those factors play, but that would require more data. And then finally, following well-established patterns. Now, venture capitalists are creatures of habit. They tend to invest in companies that have an exit, meaning they're either bought out or they go public, in specific industries. And over the last 10 years, it's been medicine, tech, science firms. And so if you fall outside of those trends, you're less likely to get funding. Now, what the commission really struggled with, and there was two questions. Are there underrepresented people who are actually in those trends and are overlooked? And are there scalable ideas that are outside of those trends? Yes to both, right? But again, we want to know how much those questions we're struggling with are a factor in those numbers. So at this point, I'm going to bring up my wonderful colleague, Charlie Cooksey, who is the founder and CEO of WePower. Charlie, please.
Good morning. So I'll add on 2 additional friction points in addition to the ones that Andre just shared. So I get the pleasure of working with Black and Latinx entrepreneurs every day through the work at WePower. And there's 2 experiences that I often have. Really brilliant Black and Latinx folks with really brilliant ideas who are so excited for us to offer capital, funding, resources for them to take their idea to the next level. And unfortunately, we focus specifically on entrepreneurs that are past the idea stage and are ready to scale. And the look on their faces and the sense of defeat, not being able to access those resources to take their idea to launch it's overwhelming for me and I think for all of us, which brings us here today. And the other challenge is there are amazing companies that have launched, that have traction, but they need that catalytic capital to go to the next level. So there's always this tension of we want to do good work, but how do we make sure that we are addressing those who are the ideators, those who are the entrepreneurs, but are ready to go to the next level? So I'll kick off these 2 friction points by posing a question, and that is how many ideators don't get to become entrepreneurs because of these systemic issues or friction points? There are so many ideas that never get to come to life because underrepresented entrepreneurs lack access to seed capital. And Akeem spoke to it and several others, but our economy is missing out on tons of opportunities. There's a report that was published a few years ago called The Business Case for Racial Equity. Thank you, called The Business Case for Racial Equity. And in that report, it said that 9 million jobs are getting left on the table because we aren't providing access to capital for entrepreneurs of color to get their idea into the launch phase. So with that, one of these friction points is access to seed funding. And what does that mean? We spoke earlier about the opportunity to create wealth through entrepreneurship, but it's also the challenge. When we think about entrepreneurs of color in particular and women, household wealth and median household wealth is so much smaller compared to that of white households. So there's some other data that Kaufman published a while ago that says it takes about $30,000 to get a company off of the ground. The $30,000 price tag is way larger than the median household wealth for a Black family. And so we are missing out on all of these great ideas for folks who have lived experiences that can solve problems because we have a racial wealth gap, among other things. So not only is that racial wealth gap a challenge, but even some of those more traditional funding opportunities, bank loans, the friends and family, are not as readily accessible for women and underrepresented entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color. That 5th friction point is about founders can't afford to fail. It's expensive to create capital to grow our revenue, and Unfortunately, too often, women in particular have to choose between, do I stick to this well-paying job so that I can send my kids to childcare, or do I take that leap and found a company or scale a company, which also means I may not be able to provide my child, my baby, with the basic opportunity to learn and grow in a childcare experience? Or do I choose between this job that provides benefits like healthcare for myself and my family, or do I take that leap? And the pandemic was a great case study about how underrepresented entrepreneurs can't afford to fail. When everything shut down, many businesses were able to stay open, but a lot were not. By April of the pandemic, about 41% of Black-owned businesses closed and never reopened. And so that, to me, illustrates the fact that when things hit our country, they hit underrepresented entrepreneurs even harder. So we have to think about all these friction points as we think about solutions. So I will pass it to Doug and my other colleagues to talk about what are solutions or recommendations we can consider to address these friction points.
So all my students who are watching know that we teach at WashU to first fall in love with the problem. First, fall in love with the problem and make sure that you understand it. These are great lessons for life, great lessons for entrepreneurship. But you can't just hang out in the problem area. We also teach what can we do about it as well. So we're now going to present some recommendations here, and this is an exciting group of recommendations and an exciting group of commissioners where we're not necessarily experts in all of these topics as much as we are convening today kind of as concerned citizens to address these issues, put forward these solutions, and hope that others will take up the charge as we finish today. So with the first category here of transparency, I'm going to bring to the stage Ming-Soo Wong, who's going to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. So our first set of recommendations that we came up together as a commission centers on improving transparency, quality, and access to data. Now, what we know for sure is that what gets measured gets done. But right now, efforts in this direction are running up against barriers, in particular 2 barriers related to data. First is the collection of data on race or ethnicity of VCs and founders. And second is access to data for those who want to conduct their own analyses in order to arrive at their own solutions for themselves. Now, in particular, we've heard from investors throughout our time together as a commission that they want to be intentional with how they allocate their capital, but they're unable to do so because they cannot access comprehensive and reliable data to make these well-informed decisions. So for those reasons, we make the following recommendations on the issue of data. We recommend leading data providers such as PitchBook and Crunchbase, who already provide excellent coverage of the VC and startup ecosystems and are already leaders in their reporting on diversity, to introduce an option for individuals in their database to self-report their race or ethnicity. And with their consent, to allow stakeholders and nonprofit organizations conducting research using this data to advance their progress towards addressing this funding gap. We also recommend startup investors and mentors to play an active role in this process of encouraging their founders to self-report this information in a way that also respects their right to privacy. Having more founders who understand the underlying purpose of self-reporting this information will play a critical role in helping to populate these important databases. And finally, we recommend data leaders in the space to provide a straightforward way for researchers and key stakeholders who want to move the needle on this issue to access and analyze this data for themselves, which might be done through creating new interfaces on their platforms or through entering into secure data sharing agreements. The bottom line here is that if we truly want to get to the root of these inequities, we need to solve this measurement problem first. Now I will pass it over to my colleague, Martin Hunt, CEO of SwanLab USA, to deliver our second set of recommendations.
Thank you very much, Ming. I appreciate that. There's never been a better time for equity. We've learned today that diversity is profitable. It is profitable for investors, people with pensions, and large endowments. So we believe that government has a role to play and can help. Why do we believe this? How do we know that? Because it's always helped, right? Capital gains policy, tax treatment, R&D allocations, SBIR grants, educational institutions getting money to do different things, and immigration policy. All of these things have helped companies like Apple and Google and Facebook and the ecosystem that we kind of have seen at the beginning of this presentation. And it has created a sustainable competitive advantage for America in venture capital for the past 30 years, and we believe for the next 30 years, diversity and equity in venture capital will do the same thing. Government has a role to play. $1 trillion is the number in assets under management by venture capital in the United States alone. We've seen that there's a lift for diversity. For every $1 billion invested, if you have a 3 or 4% lift over a 10-year period, increasing IRR, it generates about $500 million. And we have $1 trillion to invest. $1 trillion. So the time is now. At a time when the venture capital ecosystem has needed help and is slumping, we believe that the government can do a number of things, these 6 things, in order to help grow and to kind of lead the rebound. Transparency in the grant-making process. If we know what diversity is and we can measure it, then we can take that into consideration when we're doling out the grants. State grants or federal grants to states. SSBCI, we did that 10 years ago with 1.0, and 2.0 now is $10 billion. It was $1 billion before, it's $10 billion now. They're looking for a 10x return on their money, and we believe that will be incredibly effective. Governors all over the country right now in 50 states have discretion on how they use this money over the next few years in the first rollout, but it goes out for 10 years, but it starts right now. There are some states that are in process, in flight, highly productive. Technology hubs. Using technology hubs in conjunction with enforcement of the CHIPS Act, we believe will energize lots of different places around the country and not just in the 2 or 3 cities that we all associate with venture capital. We also believe that CRA credits that have worked well with banks can also work well with venture capital firms. So we want to also acknowledge that other types of financings, such as loans and revenue-based financing firms like WePower, can also do well and make a difference in terms of this equity. So these broad actions put in place by government, we believe will help us come out of the VC slump and kind of build the future that we need going forward. So what do we need to do that? Awareness. Awareness. We have to be aware. A lot of these things, a lot of people didn't know before this presentation and before we kind of went through this. So I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Lori Coulter, the CEO of Somersault, that will talk about awareness and what the commission believes on that.
As Doug referenced, we are a group of individuals on the commission who are not experts, but are uniquely impacted in different ways by the venture capital industry. My background is I'm a female founder that has raised a substantial amount of money, and I certainly understand the challenges across the board that underrepresented founders are faced with on a day-to-day basis, and what it would mean to really fix the problem. I loved, Martin, what you sort of laid out as it relates to the overall impact to the economy here. If we can get this right, or if we can even just move the needle just a tiny fraction, the impact for the U.S. and the world is is quite astounding. From a public awareness perspective, our goal with the commission moving forward is really to catalyze activity by various different groups. We want to fund an advocacy group of various different stakeholders that really has the goal of amplifying the data findings, encouraging researchers to dig in, and then maintaining a steady drumbeat of media relations, social media campaigns, and then just again, encouraging researchers to convene together and explore additional solutions that are beyond what we've even identified here. Secondarily, we believe it's very important to create a public dashboard, ideally integrated with PitchBook, Crunchbase, or others, that really measures the performance of various different funds and their investors as it relates to accountability for diversity metrics. And with that, I want to pass it back to Doug to wrap us up.
So I'm very proud of this group and us coming together as a team over the last 8 months to pull this off. It's exciting to present this data. We're hopeful that people are listening. We're hopeful that folks will run with these recommendations after this. And we like we said before, we believe in America, and we're hopeful for change here. There's just real opportunities as we've outlined today. So I'd like to bring up on stage now all of the commissioners to take questions from the audience and those at home as well. But join me in thanking the commissioners for their work as they come up on stage. In the audience or online? Yes, go ahead.
Still morning. Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Michelle M. Warner, and I am a business owner here in DC. I own a tech-driven wine retail company that provides personalized wine services for wine lovers. I'm also looking to start another business in fertility care and technology. I was curious, I think, sir, you presented an outlier in your chart with 4 women, if you were 4 women founders, and it sounded like it was one particular company that received a lot of money. And I was curious to learn more about that outlier, because I wonder if when we look at the types of companies that women, Black and Latinx founders tend to develop, how fundable they are in the sense of the way that VCs typically look at certain types of companies. Like we were talking about tech-based companies, like Google, Facebook, things like that. The persons of color, other business owners and founders that I know tend to start companies that also help our fellow individuals, you know. For instance, me in fertility care, there's a company here based in DC that is helping individuals who are in prison and allowing their families to send postcards to their loved ones who are in prison. Another company that is working on healthcare for African American individuals who go to barbershops and ways to better capture their health data so that we can understand how to really make an impact in their lives. So I'm just curious about that particular outlier because I don't know that VCs tend to look at the companies that, at least the individuals that I have been around, who are persons of color, they don't seem to be like the type of, they don't seem to be like the type of companies that people tend to fund.
Respond to that in two ways, and then Ming, if I get anything wrong or if you have something to add, please do so. The outlier company is a company called Figure, which is just straight up fintech. So blockchain, fintech, bunch of women founders. So that was the outlier. I don't know if that confirms or disconfirms your hypothesis, but it was very much in the wheelhouse of traditional venture capital. Now, I'm going to. My wife, who's also a professor at Olin Business School, tells me the story of a woman who was pitching a breast pump to venture capitalists. And at the end of the talk, she says two things. One is, you probably didn't realize, but I was pumping all during this talk, and that's how good my technology is. And the men who are in the room say, there's no market for this. And so, I mean, I think the story there was men, venture capitalists there can't visualize the problem or the need or the demand. But once it's uncovered, perhaps the idea itself is venture investable. And so, and when you talk about fertility, maybe that's a problem of women, but women are half the population. It's a huge market. It's not small. Yeah. Okay. Good. And so that's something we've all dealt with and struggled with. The not being able to see the opportunity because it's not part of your lived experience, or it's so far out of even what your people in your network talk about, is maybe one of the pattern matching issues, or issue 3, that continues to carry forward, and that can be, we at least hypothesize that can be overcome.
I would like to build on that too. I think also what I heard in your reflections and question is around there are companies that are not always tech companies, are not always fitting the profile of a venture backable, fitting the criteria for being venture backable. And so part of our solutions are there are other forms of capital that we should be considering. And I think that what we've seen is we have like sensationalized and lifted up the Facebook founders and Apple founders and Amazon and Uber founders is like, that is the gold standard. And no matter what type of business I have, even if it's a candle business, I need to shoot for accessing the same type of capital they did and like take my company public, which is just not realistic for most of our companies in this country. And so we do have to consider what are other forms of capital that allow all these diverse types of businesses to move from idea stage to launch to scale to maximum impact, and that may not be VC capital, and that's okay. So I think pairing the public awareness with other forms of capital and other solutions are really critical because it really is a both and.
I really agree with that statement because there are opportunities to bootstrap your business, and I think we've talked so much that you guys started with VC already, and I wish we kind of changed the conversation a little bit to start with, here are all the other types of opportunities to raise money, and oh, by the way, you can own 100% of your company if you work at it in these following ways. I think so.
I think that's a great point. I think it's 4 million new businesses are created every year. Very few receive venture capital.
I promise you I don't need the mic. Oh, okay. Well, I work with a lot of companies, and I see a lot of this as a social issue. The pump is an excellent example. I have one client who has 3 little boys. Now, you know what's the difference between a male and a government bond? The government bond will mature eventually. Okay, the 3 little... And notice the women laugh. It's a social issue. She has 3 little boys. There's soccer shoes, it's Tycos, it's Legos, it's, whatever you want. And the house looks like a hurricane passed through. So how do we solve that? And she created, you can look it up, Lay and Go. And when she tried to talk to men about it, it's like, what's it? You're a housewife. You go clean it. They weren't interested in the concept of a clean house because you've got a wife, she'll do it, right? Okay. However, when she eventually got those bank loans and other support and family loans and so forth, and just blew up the market, there were a lot of women who were very interested. She then created a similar product that served the military. Oh, now gotta have it, right? Because the men could identify with the need. And to me, this is a social issue, and your example was perfect. And I think even with banks, he goes in and, oh, what a respected professor, oof. When, what was it you wanted that loan for? No problem. She goes in, black girl, right? The banker sees people differently. That's a social issue, and I think that's something, even you have phenomenal ideas up there, but it's another area where we need to find a way, I'm going to call it education, social, to break down those barriers where an idea may not be for you, but it could be awesome for her. So just my thought.
I'd like to comment, Doug. So as we heard from researchers and then kind of reviewed the literature, there was a study or a paper done by Dana Kanzi from Columbia at the time. I don't think she's there now. But essentially it looked at the questions female founders receive in a pitch at any given time. And what it really showed is 65% of the time women are asked prevention questions. So that's essentially why you will never get to that $1 billion valuation, as opposed to saying actually why you get to that. So if you're always asked a risk mitigation or a prevention question, you never get to tell the story about why you can be a $1 billion or $10 billion business. And it's exactly the opposite. Men get those questions only 35% of the time. And so to your point, this is a social framework. And what's fascinating about that study, it didn't matter if the investor was a male or a woman. And so we as individuals, and every time I speak to Doug or Derek's classes, I almost always take the opportunity to say and identify when I get asked a prevention question, because I almost always do.
And to that, I'd like to just add that this gets at the commentary that my colleague Andre made about homophily. And in my diversity, equity, and inclusion class, I have my students actually run through what's called a trusted 10 exercise, where they actually write down the name of 10 people they trust. Then I had them unfold the other sheet of the paper to say, DEI dimensions, race, ethnicity, could be neurodiversity, the different DEI, LGBTQIA. And then I asked the students, for each of their trusted 10, check off the DEI dimensions that are similar to yours. And what we often find is that people are attracted or trust people who are just like them. So you're right, those barriers need to change, and they're difficult to break down because people grow up with them. A lot of these things people learn at home.
So the news is, though, it's changing. Money is social. Right? Money is social. So in the venture space, money is social. As we change what we see, as we change who gets funded, as we change the success stories that we do see, and I see them every day. I mean, there are hundreds of underrepresented folks doing amazing things, and to hear their stories almost makes it hard for me to hear that they don't exist. Exist. And so what, as a venture capitalist who looks at inclusive talent, excellence, I think in the next 4 or 5 years, you'll see a tremendous amount of funded women, a tremendous amount of funded Latinx and African Americans that make it to that next level. Those stories will change, and it will change the actual conversation that we have and the social aspect that goes along with when someone walks up. They'll understand that, hey, a person that's underrepresented wearing a hoodie, that's 20 years old, that just dropped out of college, may just be Zuckerberg. So I think my hope is that, what we start to see with our study is that this is changing.
So I will take some more questions from this crowd. I do want to be respectful to our virtual crowd as well. Kurt, do we have a question from that group?
Yeah. We sometimes hear, sorry. Oh.
I'll come right back to her. Yeah.
We sometimes hear that funders have difficulty identifying fundable startups from these populations. And I wonder if you looked at that, discussed it, and what your thoughts are about that.
I think I take what they say at face value. If they have a hard time, they have a hard time. Having said that, I don't have a hard time, right? When I go to the networks that I see that are major networks, they're diverse right now. They see diversity. I graduated from Harvard Business School. I belong part of the Harvard Business School Angels of New York City and around the world. They're seeing diversity in what they see, right? Same thing at Stanford. You go to Stanford, you see diversity all around you. So you go to a lot of top schools, a lot of other schools, a lot of HBCUs, which to me, it's hard not to see, right? They're there, and they're there in droves. Now, the issue is if you don't see them, we wouldn't expect for them to see them because they've never seen them. And they're just now starting to see folks that have been there all along, or folks that just now in the last 30 years have a propensity to be in all the right places. So I take at face value what they see and what they say. However, what I know, especially with my colleague and my cohort, which is still quite old, and the new cohort is better, what you're going to see is a bunch of founders that look like Obama that are doing well, or that look like a Hillary Clinton that are doing well. You're going to see this, and it's going to be clear and present that the talent is there, and that we're going to have to find different ways to take off the blinders to see that talent, but that when we choose the best talent, it will be more inclusive than what we saw in the numbers to begin with. And you can start to see it in Doug's slide or Dan's slide that kind of had, the college degrees in STEM, the college degrees, et cetera, et cetera. So the metrics by which virtue and talent is measured has dramatically changed. And what has not changed yet is venture capital from the standpoint of how they choose, but it will.
I want to briefly build on that. One, I just want to go back to the recommendation of data transparency. That's why it's so important, because the more we have clear data, disaggregated data, the more we will be able to say, is that true or not, which I believe that it isn't a pipeline problem. And then I think to connect the point you were making into this question, and this is a theory, I don't have data to back this, but I do think that we start to see tipping points with systems level issues when our moral responsibility starts to intersect with economic barriers. And I think a good example of that is childcare. So the childcare community was in crisis before the pandemic, but because it's almost 100% women ran workforce, and because it's still seen as babysitting, we haven't had a serious conversation until now about the critical need to invest in childcare. And so even in Missouri, we have a conservative governor who is now promoting and advocating for a huge infusion into the childcare system, which is exciting. And I think that's because there's now this intersection between the business community is getting harmed by not enough women re-entering the workforce. And so it intersects with my feeling of we have a moral responsibility to invest in childcare. And I think that as what has been the minority people of color in this country, we're shifting to this country becoming a majority people of color. I do wonder if it's going to be, it will be detrimental to the economics of the venture capital world to continue to stick to this homophily concept, because there will be more folks of color who have more experiences in this country and need solutions via companies and startups that respond to those solutions. So I hope that as we see a shift in the demographics of our country, it will put more pressure on the VC community to work with more diverse founders.
I just wanted to introduce something that, because I think when we describe homophily and or sort of the social constructs that influence us to invest in certain people, we frame it as a case of individual choice, individual decisions. While that is true, there's also this idea that limited partners, the pension funds, the endowments, that's your money collectively. And so it's not just a matter of an individual or a general partner, the folks who actually make the decisions of where they're going to invest. Now, it's not just that issue. It's, do we have the social appetite to change where we want to invest? You see some of that in the conversations around ESG. You see some, particularly around climate. I think people are starting to say, hey, why are we continually investing in fossil fuel? But even there's like, look, I want a return on my investment. I want a greater yield on my retirement fund. And so I actually think that's the larger problem. We can always address individual decisions. It is much harder to look at this as when you see the collective choices we make as a society. And then, you know, another thing I just wanted to address, it was in the first question, is that unfortunately, I do believe that there are social problems that are scalable, that deserve venture capital, but they just simply don't fall in these traditional sectors. I mean, when you're talking about education, housing, criminal justice, it's a sad thing to say we actually need big moonshot solutions, and people are thirsting for this. So when you're a person of color coming from you want that panacea. You want that big idea because you see the scale of the problem. Unfortunately, if you don't walk in those shoes, you don't see the scale of the problem. But these problems are scalable. So that is, and so there's that issue, but I just wanted to bring that up. But it's not a matter of addressing a few white men in the room. This is about addressing what you describe is that value is socially constructed. And we simply aren't seeing value collectively in certain firms as opposed to others.
Do you want to add? Go ahead.
If I could follow up on Andre's, and Andre's done incredible work in this area, in the set of housing, but you mentioned something about limited partners, the people who provide funds to the venture capitalists for investment. So there's an institutional limited partners association that has a diversity in action plan. There are about 300 financial institutions that have signed up for that. Those limited partners at least have attested to their desire to make some changes. And we hope that more limited partners will sign up for that university endowments will also adopt those values to have capital deployed more broadly, and that will also hold them accountable for their promises. It's one thing to sign a statement saying, I want to see this happen. It's another thing to insist that it happen, to follow up on it, to celebrate the successes and acknowledge the failures. And so the limited partners, the people who are supplying funds to these industries are incredibly important. Martin made a statement in one of our early meetings. Is it okay if which was, if some of this money is coming from public pensions, teachers' pensions and the like, and so we're happy to take money from very kind of diverse individuals, but we're not happy to deploy them equally well. And so there is not only is economic imperative, but I think a moral imperative to match the fund deployment with at least some of the people who are supplying them.
So a DT, and then we'll take another question. Go
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that, which is, so in my work, I study diversity and equity and inclusion in organizations, and we have a concept called, or a theory of the contact hypothesis, which is that the more contact you have across social identity categories, the more sort of willing you are to engage with those categories and actually take their perspective and understand and be more accepting and all of those things. And so one of the scalable solutions, I think Martin was talking about this earlier, which goes to both the supply side and the demand side, is the SSBCI grants, right? They have special money allocated to first-time funds. So that opens up access to VCs who, you know, the general partners that aren't the traditional general partners, if you can get access to funds as a first-time fund. And the CHIPS and Science Act has this idea of creating regional tech hubs, right? And that is going to create a groundswell behind workforce development. So if you have these first-time funds in all these non-traditional locations, and alongside you have these like regional tech hubs, you're getting that matching and you're getting that contact, and maybe that's scalable.
Very good. Would you like to ask a question? Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Etta Nahapetian with Fairfax County, Virginia, just right across the river. And I'm the program manager for a new program we just launched a couple of weeks ago called Fairfax Founders Fund, which is a grant program for early stage founders. And we're targeting underrepresented founders. And what we're struggling with is finding them, because we know that they're there. I mean, we know that over the past decades, for example, there's been an exponential increase of women and people of color going into engineering programs. So they're out there. They just need an opportunity. But when we do, it's been like hand-to-hand combat finding them, because we're not reaching them through the traditional communication channels that we have with reaching out to businesses. Local government, you know, we've got contacts at the Chamber of Commerce or, you know, the Tech Association. And when we are trying to figure out our communication challenge for people of color, it's usually through family services and folks that are in need of local government services in that way. And when we do reach these engineers who are trying to start something out of their basement, they're like, oh, I never heard of that program. I never heard of that. I never heard of that. I never heard of that. That's available through the state. I had no idea. And it's things that folks that we talk to through traditional channels, they've known for years. So we're trying to figure out and open to suggestions, you know, we're just, like I said, hand-to-hand combat of who do you know? Who do you know? Who do you know? What are some creative ways that we can find people to reach them?
I just have one clarifying question. Are you having trouble finding founders or in general, or you're having trouble finding underrepresented founders?
I would say underrepresented founders, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as one of those underrepresented founders that benefited from multiple grant programs, you know, typically the way I found them was either word of mouth or social media. I think today, you know, when you're talking about those type of founders, right, they're not traditional, right? So like there's a platform called F6S, I believe, that aggregates tons of these different grant programs onto one single platform. And if you're in tech, you know about it, but if you're not, you wouldn't go there to find those types of grants. But I do think that the power of traditional media, local news, combined with the power of social media is a great way to reach a lot of these businesses. You know, when you're doing segmentation within like Facebook or Instagram, you can spend maybe a few $100s and target pretty much everyone within your region that owns or runs a business, and it'll pop up in their feed and give them that opportunity. But, you know, just to kind of speak on a little more why I think what you're doing is important is that, you know, I found myself 3 years into my business, just getting to that point where we were scaling. And Lori had made a really good comment the other day where she said, hey, if you're a business and it takes you 3-4 years to get to $1 million in revenue, you're not venture backable. You're not investable business. And so but that's me, right? And so when I was starting, I wasn't thinking, oh, I need to get to $1 million in a year so I can be a venture backable business so I can raise money. That wasn't my thought. It was just, let me start this idea. So having grant programs like this for these founders who, they're not thinking, let me create this disruptive technology and receive millions of dollars in backing. It's important that there's programs like yours and others that exist so that they know what opportunities are out there, because sometimes you think you have a small idea, but you actually have a really big idea. And it's just a framing issue that takes you down a different path.
Where are you based? Can I ask?
Fairfax County. So we're Dulles, if you flew in through Dulles Airport, that was Fairfax County.
I know it well. I used to work for AMS.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, I thought you guys are all from St. Louis.
Help is on the way. Let me just start with that. One of the programs that we talked about was the MBDA. They have a $100 million grant that went out a few months ago, and the purpose of that is to look around the country and give it to technical providers focused on underrepresented founders, to go find them and give them help and to push them out to folks like yours. So I have a few ideas. I'll give them to you, but I think every state now, if it's the case, and I know that a lot of people in Maryland did step forward. A lot of people in Fairfax and this area, the Mid-Atlantic region, stepped forward with grants. So those are going to be allocated, I believe, within 60 to 90 days. And those providers will be experts at reaching this population.
MBDA, you say?
Yeah, the Minority Business Development Agency had a grant, and I'm not sure what the name of the grant is, but if you look it up, you'll see that. And at least they will know who the winners would be in your state.
That's a great idea.
But I don't want to lose sight of what this presentation is all about. Invest in a firm that will address your problem. There are social networking tech firms that are owned by people of color that is addressing this networking issue. If you see a problem, and I hear this continuously. Oh, go.
Can we say that Blavity is one of those?
Blavity is one of them. There are tech firms who are trying to do this. OHub in Atlanta. I'm on the advisory board of Zeal Capital. They're a venture-backed firm focused on people of color. They have technologists who are working on these networking tools. So I would say that part of your focus, if you identify a problem, there is an app for that, right? And you should really focus on not saying, I can't find anyone, more so, I need to find a firm that can address my problem. And then it becomes much easier to locate someone that will address. And then, but one more thing, it is clear that networks are a major barrier to investment, and we don't spend enough time researching the power of networks. But it's something I think in the next iteration that we need to spend a lot of time talking about how ideas, revenue, and this social goods are exchanged around the networks that we traditionally have.
I want to add to that and be pretty brief because I see. So I think there are like ecosystem and regional level solutions, and I think there's like government solutions. And across both of those, I think the theme is like we have to be doing this work in coalition. And I can speak to, in St. Louis in particular, we run an accelerator that supports 10 entrepreneurs per cohort. We're getting well over 100, sometimes 200 applications. And it's overwhelming to receive that many applications and to only be able to accept 10. And we only work with Black and Latinx founders. And so I would say, like, think about the work in coalition, like what are 5 to 10 other entrepreneur support organizations in the region? Because I bet $1 million that they have folks that they have to turn away, and you could be providing that service to the companies they can't support. And I think what's really cool at the federal and the governmental level is we're seeing grants and funding, like I get all the acronyms from NBDA, MDBA, whatever it is, Build Back Better. These federal grants are incentivizing and forcing the local entrepreneur support orgs to work together. And I think that we're going to maximize impact when we're not doing it in silos. So in St. Louis, we were one of the grantees across the country that won about $25 million. And we, as in the region, not WePower, but I'm very confident that the region would not have won that $25 million if a single entity submitted that proposal. And so now we're able to leverage that $25 million and talk to each other and say, all right, WePower can support these entrepreneurs, this org can support these entrepreneurs, and figure out how do we create an ecosystem of support so that it's not just a single organization trying to solve this really big problem.
So we're gonna take a question from the audience and then here, and then we'll go to one online. Okay, so go ahead. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Bridgman. I'm founder of a business called the Game Room Club. It's an affordable country club for gamers. Think kind of like Top Golf for gamers, mixed with a little bit of Comic-Con in there. Close. As a founder, who is in the process of seeking out funding, and I know a lot of us, we want to get to the point where we can give back, but we would love to know, as folks who do, especially minority, when it comes to business, we're thinking about, okay, bootstrapping, debt, those kinds of things are opportunities. With what you guys are discussing today, how can we help speed the process along? How can we help to close that knowledge gap?
So I don't know if you know my story, but I've raised $50 million, and we target women with lifestyle apparel. It initially was just swimwear. So 2 women founders on the Mississippi River in the center of the country, raising $50 million initially to sell women's swimwear is a hard sell.
Well done. Yeah.
And what I would tell you is we learned how to tell the biggest vision of our story and what we really could be. It wasn't just about selling swimsuits, right? It's about inspiring women to engage with life. Why had swimwear been done in an over-sexualized way for so long, which, by the way, on social media looks tired and dated today, right? Why are we not highlighting real women, encouraging them to engage with life and get back to the beach? And why are we passing along these hangups to the next generation? By the way, how many women are there in the world? And apparel is a $1 trillion industry, one of 7 in the world. And so this is a venture-backable initiative. You do have to be disrupting an industry, right? And so when I got asked, how are you going to not lose the $1 million that you're investing in inventory? What happens? I never tell that $1 trillion apparel story. And so what I would tell you is practice your pitch. Don't start with your number 1, 2, 3, or even top 10 targets. Start and learn. Investors are very predictable. They're going to ask the same questions over and over again. Observe what works. Make sure, if you have a co-founder, make sure you're holding each other accountable for painting the biggest vision of what your opportunity can be, and don't be shy about telling that story.
You have a question? Thank you.
Yeah, we have a question from the virtual audience. Molly wants, it sounds like she'd like you to build a little bit on the can't fail theme that you talked about and creating an environment where women and minority founders have the social support to start companies. I wonder if you can build on any of that a little bit.
Yeah, I remember when I started, my business, it couldn't be a business that loses money. It needed to pay the bills, right? And I think that when you have that mindset that I came from of every month, I need to make more money than I spend and also be able to afford to live, that was my mindset for years, which is why I wasn't growing. And I didn't even realize the reason I wasn't growing is I wasn't able to take risk. And so, I was actually fortunate because I had a nest egg that I had saved away. So I had, probably close to $100,000 in savings that I was able to say, okay, I don't need to make money, I just don't need to lose money, and then I'll be okay. But for a lot of founders, that's not the case. And so it wasn't until a mentor of mine actually through a grant program told me, he's like, it's just you're never gonna grow this business if you can't lose $100,000 a month. Like, you're not gonna grow the business. And so when your mindset comes from, okay, how do I survive? How do I create a business that produces enough income for me to live? Like, you can't think big. You have to, you're always thinking small, and you don't even realize it. And so I think that, it's absolutely critical that we invest this money into ideas that could be big so that they're not thinking, how do I survive day to day? They're thinking, how do I grow this and support hundreds of people so that we can all thrive? So I think it is a mindset shift that has to happen, but it only comes when you receive that funding.
And it's more than a mindset, right? It's education. So when you think about the kind of success of a Amazon, are they profitable? Were they profitable? They were not profitable for the longest time, but their company valuation was always high. So that dichotomy of understanding economic value and the lifetime value of a company versus did you make money last year is very different. So especially when you talk about e-gaming, it's huge. It's huge. There are people out there getting tremendous amounts of money to go do that. They may have a similar idea, you go look at whatever, but if your idea is special and you want to compete with them, you're going to have to tell a story that you can invest in your business, so get money from investors, invest in your business in such a way that you can build economic value in the eyes of the investor while you're losing cash flow, and that can give you an exit that eventually will make them money. That's a mindset and an education that has to go along with the entrepreneur first in order for them to even be able to pitch that.
And what I don't like about the current narrative around venture capital is that we've romanticized the hardship of the founder too much, and sometimes it's woefully inaccurate. That this idea that people are living in their cars, going days without eating, may be true at an individual level. The reality is most people start their firms using the equity in their home, drawing upon their 401ks. They have some nest egg as a cushion. The wealth divide, the racial wealth divide in this country is where white, the average median white wealth is about 8 times that of blacks, about 6 times that of Latinos. And so we just need to acknowledge, on average, some people have less cushions than others. If you have less home ownership, which is a direct result of discrimination, you're going to have less founders. If you have less equity in your home, you're going to have less founders. If your racial category or group work in sectors that don't have retirement funds, guess what? So I think the narrative has been, you just got to grind, and you do have to grind. But the grind is a lot different. When not only are you in debt, your grandfather was in debt. Your mother was in debt. It's a different hustle. So that's why I hear you just cannot fail because you're already so far in the red that. And there's one other thing. Just Fed Reserve did a study on intergenerational wealth transfers upon college graduation. When white families graduate from college, white student graduate from college, they can expect an intergenerational wealth transfer. You get a down payment on a home, you get a car, you get something like that. When black people graduate from college, guess what? You're expected to contribute to the family. Yeah, it's like, so I just wanted to acknowledge that the venture capital world received an outsized it got outside attention on shifting the narrative of what it takes to start a business. And sometimes it's just not really, it's not as accurate as we would like.
I would just add to that, beyond the economic consequences, economic issues, there was a very interesting paper presented at our research conference which suggested that when Latinx or African American founders fail, the outside world blames them. When white founders fail, they blame the market. And so there's this attribution challenge that rides on top of these other things that also increases the cost of failure. So when we say can't afford to fail, your reputation takes a different hit if you're one kind of person than another kind of person. If you'll fail as 85%, 90% of startups will.
Okay, one more.
Yes, and just before you do that, I'm going to ask all the commissioners to give kind of a parting thought here so you can begin to prepare that. But go ahead, Charlie.
So the first cycle of our accelerator, we had done all of our recruitment in 2019 and then kicked it off right when the pandemic hit. But it actually we have some really solid data from that first cohort. But anyhow, we had, because our goal was how do we get entrepreneurs ready to access capital, one of the things that we did focus on was partnering with the CDFI to say we want our entrepreneurs to get coaching on improving their credit score and being able to access some of those more traditional sources of capital like loans. And we got slapped in the face with just brutal honesty from our entrepreneurs who half of them refused to meet with the credit coaches, and the other ones were like, I have so much trauma from engaging with banks and engaging in conversations in my family around the inequity experience with home loans and other types of loans that I don't even want to entertain the thought of a loan because it's been so punitive to me and my family for generations. And so there's just so many layers to it where even with there being some loans that are accessible for underrepresented entrepreneurs, the trauma of what these systems have done to underrepresented entrepreneurs and their families creates a barrier in itself. So I just want to name that and name that, like, we have to think about both the experience and the history of what we've done around capital and entrepreneurs of color, and also think about the solutions moving forward. And there's also this like subculture, I would say particularly in the Black startup community, where like side hustle. And there's so many great ideas that if they had just a little more infusion of capital, that these don't have to be the side hustle. But back to the point of can't afford to fail, I think that we've been conditioned to like, I have to keep this traditional 9 to 5, I have to provide for my family, and I can never take this idea for more than a side hustle because I have so many folks relying on me to provide for the family.
Very good. So can we do some parting thoughts? Do you mind going first?
Parting thoughts, right? I'd say think big. Think of your biggest idea, write it down, and then come back a week later and think bigger because it's not big enough. If we look at our parents and our parents' parents, and you're a woman or you're an African American, and you look and you think about your grandparents' journey from 1950s to now and that progress, I believe that amount of progress will happen between now and 10 years from now. When I talk to my kids and I talk to them about, the time before an iPhone, the time before a Google, right? And the kids coming now, the time before GP chat, you need to be able to think as large as you possibly can because the opportunity is starting right now. The fact that you can see our presentation and you can understand that we can articulate the nature of the problem and the opening up of $1 trillion, a 1% or 2% or 3% move is more than that's been done for those populations in the history of the world. period. So my parting thought would be try to think as large as you possibly can, think big, and you have more resources now than ever to start a business. You can do better competitor analysis and learn from their presentations on how big they're thinking in order for you to make your idea special and differentiate.
My thoughts are just going back to the commission's recommendations. We spent a lot of time looking at hundreds, really, of potential problems and then also solutions. And I think we did an excellent job of paring it down to sort of the three main themes around data transparency, which to me, that was the biggest aha. Like, this isn't being measured properly. And what that means is we don't understand the hindrance we are actually putting on the U.S. economy by not investing in these diverse populations and ideas from diverse populations, right? And so data transparency was a really huge insight that I think should have been right in everyone's faces, but it wasn't. The government support, I think, continuing to refine the solutions there. And to one of the audience members' questions, educate founders on what is really available. I still, as a founder, find it difficult to really understand what is out there and available to us. And the third piece, we really do want someone to take up the mantle to really advocate on behalf of the various stakeholders in the industry. And so that includes venture capital funds, but also founders, but also investors in venture capital funds, to make sure that we are representing properly the agendas of each of those stakeholders, but then also making sure we're getting funds into the hands of diverse founders. And then just understanding that this is a true issue. I mean, 3% of $1 trillion is going to diverse founders. 3, and this is 2023. Like, what is happening? And that's my last thought.
Yeah, I just want to echo data transparency is my primary parting thought, but I also just wanted to send a special shout out to the commissioners themselves. A lot of work has been poured out of this and a lot of wrangling over ideas, and I want to just thank you for struggling together. And also want to thank WashU Olin School of Business and Brookings for working together. I hope we continue to partnership with under this bellwether initiative. But I can't say enough that it really takes these kinds of activities to spark change. And so my only parting shot is let's continue this kind of work.
I have 2 closing thoughts. One is we need a diverse set of systems level solutions. And I believe that the recommendations that we post today are some of those diverse solutions at the systems level. And within that, there is no single organization, no single person, no single solution that is going to address this really big problem of inequitable funding in the VC world. And so I think that as amazing as Akeem is, Morgan of Blavity, there are other innovative concepts and thoughts that deserve capital, deserve support, deserve to be brought to the forefront, and that we can't keep celebrating these one-offs, and that we can solve this problem by systems and policy change. And then the second thought I remember. The second thought is that which kind of ties to the first one, is that there's more ways to finance startups beyond venture capital, and we need to distribute some of the resources more to those. Not every company wants to give up equity. Not every company is a tech-enabled company. Not every company is designed for VC capital, and that's okay. And so we should start to celebrate and fund more of those alternative forms of capital so that we can see more entrepreneurs contributing to our economy and creating jobs. And then lastly, just thanks for this opportunity. I've enjoyed our vigorous debate and disagreements. I think it's led to a solid set of recommendations for the community to consider.
Yeah, I think that the systematic change is what's needed here. One of the big recommendations we had was that government intervention, and we've seen many times throughout our history where government has pushed an industry to either change or has helped to prop up an industry, and it's completely transformed it. The reason that we're one of the breadbaskets of the world is because of government intervention. They said, hey, we'll buy your corn. Even if no one else will, we'll buy it. One of the reasons that we're seeing renewable energy, have this huge surge and solar energy is now affordable is because the government said, hey, we'll buy it. Even though right now it makes no sense for you to do it, we'll pay for it. We want to see it happen. And we ultimately see these industries mature and ultimately shift. And I think that, there is a role that government can play here through, tax policy and incentives and sometimes a big stick and say like, hey, we can invest in the rest of our country. And as you kind of mentioned, it's not that every company needs to be VC backable, but many companies are investable. And right now, there are not a lot of methods to invest in these companies. Banks don't do that anymore. It's not part of their business model. So I do think that those alternative options are really important so that we can invest in the broader scope of our economy and not just a very narrow sector.
I do want to thank Doug, Dan, and Giselle, and Ming, and Aditi, and all the other kind of Olin team members that supported this. On behalf of the entire commissioner set, I mean, what you all have pulled off in really a short amount of time is extraordinary, and it's been, difficult topics at many times that you all have handled just with, such extreme professionalism and sensitivity, and hopefully we'll do a ton of good as we move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much. I'm gonna invite our Vice Dean, Mark Leary, up just in a second to close us out. Giselle, you were talking about in class, folks making a list of folks that they trust in their network, and I'm proud to have you all in my network as well as a result of this experience. I'm better for it and can't wait to see the world join us as well. So with that, I'll bring up Vice Dean Mark Leary to close us out.
All right, thanks, Doug, and thank you all for not only a wonderful presentation earlier, but for this dialogue, which I think has really brought out a breadth of insights and ideas to address what unfortunately has been an enduring trend in the VC system. But to Martin's point from earlier, our hope is that this is a has-been trend and not necessarily a will-be trend. And so our hope is that this dialogue doesn't end with the close of our program today, but really becomes the start of an ongoing conversation as we look forward to implementing some of the suggestions and ideas here and exploring additional ways to address the challenge. So just wanted to take the opportunity once again to thank our commission members, our faculty, our students, as well as especially the Bellwether Foundation for their support of this program. This is a work that I think is really emblematic of what WashU Olin Business School strives to represent. We are dedicated to applying the rigorous use of data, but combining that with careful consideration of our principles to try and address and impact critical issues in our society. And we're privileged to be able to do that in partnership with Brookings, in order to further this work of trying to influence policy for the public good. I want to finally remind you that the full commission report is available for download from the commission's website, and that link is available in the chat for those joining us virtually, as well as on the handout for those who are joining us today here in person. If you haven't gotten one of those, please see one of my colleagues who will get that to you. So as I said, I look forward to, as we go forward, thinking about how we can put some of these ideas into practice and bring them to fruition. In the meantime, we're already hard at work formulating the next project for WashU's Olin Brookings Commission for next year. So stay tuned for more on that. But thank you so much for being with us today, and hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.